Alrighty. Hey folks, on to respiratory system lesson number 2. We've talked about structure and function already with Mr. Waterman. This is Mr. Heinrich. We are going to talk about today the breathing mechanism. So what does it look like to actually inhale, exhale, and why does our body actually do that? What is controlling that process? So the big picture, sort of the two big ideas that I want you to be able to answer when you walk away from this video. How do we breathe and what controls breathing? So how do we breathe? We're going to talk about the different structures involved in bringing air into our lungs and then also expelling air from the lungs. And then what controls breathing? Like what is the trigger to actually breathe? This might be kind of a weird lesson. I do apologize. As you're watching this video, you may start thinking about your breathing, which is actually kind of strange because you've got some interesting little monitoring systems that are doing their thing on their own. You don't have to think about it. It's an automatic process. But you actually can think about it, and maybe you're going to think about it now for the next few minutes. Again, I apologize now that I've got you thinking about it. But we'll look at the different sort of brain control of your breathing rate. So here are some parts to know. Many of these bits and pieces were covered by Mr. Waterman in the first lesson. Got a couple pictures on here. There we go. So the parts of your respiratory system that will be involved in inhalation and exhalation are the diaphragm. So that is this big sheet of muscle right here. Runs at the bottom of your thoracic cavity, actually underneath your lungs. And that diaphragm, little spasms of the diaphragm is actually what causes hiccups. So every time you're hiccuping, or the next time that happens, you now know that is uncontrollable spasms of your diaphragm. So that muscle is involved, as are the intercostal muscles. We call those ribs. So if you go down to like Rib Fest, which I think has been rescheduled for September this year, and you order some delicious barbecue ribs, you are actually not eating like the rib bones themselves, but the muscle in between. Those are actually called intercostal muscles. And they can be quite tasty. There are the pleural membranes. Hopefully you can appreciate that every time you inhale and exhale, you've got these lungs filling up with air, rubbing against the inside of your rib cage. There's potentially some friction there. And so what we need is to have these pleural membranes. There's one on the inside of the thoracic cavity, the inside of your rib cage, and one also on the exterior of your lungs themselves. And then a little layer of fluid in between. So the pleural membranes are what reduce friction and allow you to breathe in and out for many, many, many years, your entire life, without friction burning holes in your lungs. That would be really, really bad. So the pleural membranes and the fluid in between them help reduce friction, and they do a fantastic job of that. You don't have to worry about friction when you breathe. You've got stretch receptors. Remember, Mr. Waterman covered those in your alveoli to prevent your lungs from overfilling with air. And then we're going to have some chemoreceptors. There are some little nerve centers in your body, actually 3 of them, that are going to measure the concentration of different chemicals, and that's going to help control how quickly or slowly you're breathing. So the breathing mechanism itself, inhalation. The biological term for inhalation, you'll also see it called inspiration. And I know this lesson is inspiring you already, but this is a different kind of inspiration. Inspiration is an active process. We'll see at the end that simply means that this actually requires the use of ATP. Cellular respiration, you have to eat. We've gone through digestion. You've turned glucose into energy at your mitochondria, and some of that energy is going to go into, that was a big breath in, inspiration. So here's what happens just in terms of structures and which way they move. Inspiration is all about muscle contraction. So what happens is when your body contracts those rib muscles, called the intercostals, your entire rib cage moves up and outwards. And you can actually take a big breath in. You can feel that. At the same time that the rib cage is contracting, your intercostals are contracting and moving your rib cage up and outwards, your diaphragm is also contracting, but it's going to move down. So now you can think about this. You've got your rib cage moving out and up, your diaphragm going downwards, and what that's going to do is increase the volume in your thoracic cavity. And when you increase the volume, that causes the pressure in that thoracic cavity to go down. We've talked about diffusion. We've talked about osmosis, how things like to go from high concentration to low concentration. You can also think about how things like to move from high pressure to low pressure. So what happens is by lowering the pressure inside of your lungs, inside of the thoracic cavity, that's going to cause air to be drawn into your lungs through your mouth and your nose. That air is going to want to move from higher pressure to that area of lower pressure. So muscle contraction lowers the pressure, that draws air into your lungs. When we have that low pressure existing in your thoracic cavity and your lungs, we call that a negative pressure. It's at a low pressure compared to the outside, and that air rushes in. Again, that process is active, which means it's using ATP. It costs you something. It costs you some energy. I do want you to keep in mind as well, I'll touch on this again, that inspiration, this active process, does actually require a nerve impulse. And it turns out, so your body sends a nerve impulse that causes those muscles to contract. And then the flip side of that is when you exhale, which we call expiration, like an expiration date on your milk in your fridge, or expiration can also mean dying, but we're not talking about that kind, don't worry. We mean exhaling is the more common term. This is passive. So that means the muscles do the opposite of contract, which is relax. But there's also no nerve impulse. So nerve impulses cause muscles to contract. And then the lack of a nerve impulse, when the nerve impulse disappears, that's when the muscles relax. So expiration is going to be all about muscles relaxing, which means there is no nerve impulse. The nerve impulse has simply gone away, and that's allowing all those muscles to relax. Now, all that's going to happen when the muscles relax is they're going to move in the opposite direction they did for inspiration. So when your rib muscles, your intercostals relax, they move down and in. Your rib cage does anyways. Your diaphragm relaxes, which actually causes it to move upwards. And as your rib cage moves down and in and your diaphragm moves upwards, that's going to decrease the volume of your thoracic cavity, which is going to increase the pressure. Things like air want to move from high to low pressure, so that's going to force air out of your lungs. And remember, that is passive. So this doesn't cost any ATP. There is no muscle contraction. There is no nerve impulse. The nerve impulse disappears. The muscles simply relax. That volume decreases, and that pushes the air out of your lungs. That creates then, we had said a negative pressure when you inspire, when you inhale. This creates a positive pressure in the thoracic cavity, which is going to force that air outwards. And that air going outwards, remember, is going to contain higher levels of CO2 than it did when you breathed in, and that CO2 is the waste product of cellular respiration, and it leaves. Now, that's the actual structures and how they move. But what actually made the nerve impulse happen in the first place? Why did inspiration or inhalation even occur? What was your body monitoring? And a lot of students, well, I should mention here, these are chemoreceptors. There are different spots in your body measuring the concentration of different chemicals. A lot of students are under the misconception that we breathe to get oxygen. And it actually turns out that for most people that is not the case. What your body is going to measure first and foremost is actually not oxygen levels, but it's actually going to measure CO2 levels. It's actually that byproduct, that poison, it really is a poison, produced by cellular respiration that is more dangerous to you. High levels of CO2 are more dangerous to your body than low levels of oxygen are. So these chemoreceptors are actually, you'll see, in the next few slides, really monitoring CO2 more than anything. The biggest chemoreceptor, the key chemoreceptor in your body, is called the central chemoreceptor, and that's the medulla oblongata, which you can see here in the picture is right at the top of your spinal cord. Right, it's sort of, we call it the brain stem. The medulla oblongata is a very important structure in terms of breathing control and doing some control of other things that we'll see later in this course. So you really want to protect that sort of brain stem, the base of your skull, basically, is where it is. That medulla oblongata is monitoring two different things. Either an increase in CO2, which happens during cellular respiration, or it's actually looking for an increase in H+ ions. And we will see in lesson number 3 why you would get an increase in H+ or hydrogen ions at the same time. But it's measuring those two things. Notice it is not measuring oxygen. So it's looking for CO2 going up, or it's looking for H+, hydrogen ions, the concentration of those going up. And if it catches either of those, it's going to trigger a nerve impulse, which means inspiration happens. So there you go, not affected by O2 levels. That is the main control. Now, here's what you do need to know. You do need to know how the medulla oblongata communicates to the intercostal muscles and your diaphragm. So how does the brain send a nerve impulse from the top of your body down to sort of your rib cage area? So the medulla, to talk to your intercostal muscles, it needs the nerve impulse to travel through actually two different nerves. So the medulla, when it catches high CO2 or high H+, sends a nerve impulse through the thoracic nerve. The thoracic nerve leads into the intercostal nerve, and those intercostal nerves innervate or are connected to the intercostal muscles, and when they receive a nerve impulse through that series of nerves, they then contract and you breathe in. Now the medulla doesn't only talk to the sort of ribs or intercostals, it also has to tell that diaphragm to contract and move downwards. Now there's only one nerve there, which is kind of nice, and it's called the phrenic nerve. So the medulla sends a nerve impulse through the phrenic nerve, which then is connected to the diaphragm. One way that I sometimes can remember that one is phrenic is a little bit like the word frantic, and hiccups, we said, are uncontrollable spasms of your diaphragm. That's kind of a frantic motion, right? These little frantic muscle contractions. So that's how my brain works. My brain is very strange. A lot of you know that. But that might help you. Medulla, phrenic nerve, that's how it communicates with the diaphragm. Now, these are called efferent nerves. You don't have to spend a huge amount of time or energy memorizing that. We're going to see this in more detail later in the course. But efferent nerves are nerves that carry impulses from the brain outwards to organs to get them to do something. So efferent means from the brain going out to some organ, like the lungs, like a muscle. Continuing with the chemoreceptors, that's the central chemoreceptor, was your medulla oblongata. It turns out there are some peripheral chemoreceptors as well. Peripheral just means on the outside. You could almost think of these as being secondary. Really what we want to have, though, is multiple layers of safety here. Just in case your medulla, for some reason, didn't catch CO2 levels going up or H+ levels going up, we do have some other receptors that might then catch that, because we do not want that CO2 or H+ to build up. Both of those things would be very bad. So the peripheral chemoreceptors are in actually two different spots in your body. One is in your aortic arch. The aorta is the biggest blood vessel coming out of your heart, the main pipe, if you want to call it that, coming out of your heart. And then your carotid arteries are the ones that run up through your neck and feed your head. So if you ever take your pulse in your neck, you're getting either a carotid artery or it could be a jugular vein, which is bringing blood back down from your head. But that carotid artery is the main artery going up and feeding the top half, your brain, top half of your body, maybe the most important half. So these ones, the aortic arch and the carotid artery, they are actually measuring increased CO2 and increased H+, exactly the same as the medulla. But these ones are a little bit different. You'll notice that they do actually look for lowered O2 levels in the blood. So it's only actually your secondary or peripheral chemoreceptors that are actually looking for O2 levels going down. That's actually really important for people who smoke regularly, because when you smoke cigarettes, you are flooding your body with CO2. And if your medulla increased respiration rate every time you smoked, these people would end up hyperventilating all the time because they're flooding their body with all that CO2 every time they have a cigarette. So what ends up happening is their bodies over time are slowly trained to not look for increased CO2 levels because they're so used to the CO2 levels being high when they smoke regularly. For people who smoke, their body, it's actually their peripheral chemoreceptors that end up doing the main job, and they actually start looking for decreased levels of oxygen in the blood because they just know that they're getting tricked by artificially high CO2 levels. So, interesting little Jeopardy fact for you. Not something you need to know for like a Biology 12 test, but hey, maybe you'll get that question on Jeopardy now. So these peripheral chemoreceptors that measure high CO2, high H+, and also low O2, that's the additional piece there, they actually talk to the medulla, and then the medulla talks to the rib cage and the diaphragm. So if these need you to inhale, they actually don't communicate directly with the muscles themselves. They tell the medulla, hey, there's an issue, we need to inhale, and then the medulla uses the nerves that we've looked at previously to contact the intercostals and the diaphragm. So here are the nerves that these peripheral chemoreceptors use to talk to your brain. The aortic bodies, that big pipe coming off your heart, sends a nerve impulse through the vagus nerve up to the medulla. That's how it communicates with your brain. And the carotid bodies, you guys will like this term, it's a mouthful. They send the nerve impulse to your brain or to the medulla through the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that one's long, but once you've written it down a few times, you'll get it. So remember from here, those receptors talk to the brain, and then the brain would use the thoracic nerve, intercostal nerve into the intercostals, and from your medulla through the phrenic nerve to your diaphragm, and that would cause inspiration. So these peripheral chemoreceptors talk to your brain through the nerves on this screen, and then your brain talks to your muscles, breathing muscles, through the nerves that we've talked about on previous slides. And these are afferent nerves. Again, don't spend too much time or energy on that term, but that just means they're carrying the nerve impulses not from the brain outwards, but from outwards to the brain. So they're taking sensory information from what's happening in and around your body, and they're carrying that to your brain, to your central nervous system. There you go. There is that lesson. Make sure you do some practice. We've got the respiration assignment that you can start plugging through. And if you have any questions on this, please feel free to email myself or Mr. Waterman, or join us for the Zooms meetings or team meetings. Chat soon.